There is a sound the ocean makes against the hull of a warship at 3 in the morning that most people will never hear. It is not a crash. It is not a roar. It is a low, patient grinding, like the sea is testing the steel with its tongue, deciding whether tonight is the night it swallows you whole. I have listened to that sound for 26 years. I have listened to it in the Persian Gulf when the air tasted like jet fuel and copper. I have listened to it in the North Atlantic when the cold was so absolute that the spray froze on the signal halyards and turned the superstructure into a cathedral of ice. And I have listened to it in port late at night when the ship was quiet and the only company I had was the hum of the radar repeater and the soft green sweep of the scope painting its endless circle. My name does not matter for this story. What matters is what I was: Operations Specialist Senior Chief. 26 years, 8 ships, 4 deployments to the Gulf, 2 to the Western Pacific, 1 to the Horn of Africa. I held a surface warfare qualification before some of the officers on my last ship were born. I had trained more junior officers in combat information center procedures than I could count, and I had watched most of them grow into competent, humble professionals who understood one fundamental truth about the Navy: the ocean does not care about your GPA, your commission source, or your father's connections. The ocean only cares about whether you respect it, and if you do not, it collects. I was stationed aboard the USS Ardent, a Flight Admiral Burke, class guided missile destroyer, hull number DDG 98. She was a proud ship. 900 tons of Aegis, equipped warfighting steel, 509 feet from bow to stern, powered by 4 General Electric LM2500 gas turbines that could push her past 30 knots when the captain asked for it. I loved that ship the way a craftsman loves a well-made tool. Not sentimentally, functionally. I knew her sounds. I knew the way her CIC smelled recycled air, warm electronics, the faint ozone bite of a dozen active radar displays. I knew the vibration pattern of her screws at 12 knots versus 18 versus 27. I knew her moods, and I knew her limits. That is the part of this story that matters. I knew what the Ardent could do, and more importantly, I knew what she could not do. And I knew the difference between courage and stupidity when it came to ship-handling. I had earned that knowledge the hard way, standing watches on bridges and in combat information centers through more close calls than I will ever admit to my wife. That knowledge lived in my hands, in my gut, in the way my neck would tighten when something felt wrong before I could even articulate why. So when Ensign Colton Price reported aboard as the new 1st Division officer, I did not panic. I had seen new ensigns before. They came in green eager and occasionally foolish, but almost all of them were trainable. You gave them time. You let the sea humble them gently. You corrected their mistakes in private and praised their progress in public, and within 6 months, most of them turned into decent junior officers. That was the system. That was how it had always worked. But Colton Price was not a standard issue ensign. He arrived on a Tuesday in late October with a sea bag that looked like it had never been opened and a handshake that was 3 pounds too firm. He was 24 years old, officer candidate school, which meant he had a civilian degree and had gone through a 16-week crash course in how to be a naval officer. In his case, the degree was an MBA from a mid-tier business school, and he had apparently spent 2 years at a management consulting firm before deciding that the Navy needed his talents. He had a jawline that could cut glass and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything because he had never been in a situation where being wrong had real consequences. I first met him in the wardroom during his introductory tour. The executive officer was walking him around, and they stopped in CIC, where I was running a routine radar calibration. The XO introduced me. Senior Chief, this is Ensign Price. He is taking over 1st Division. I shook his hand. I welcomed him aboard, and I noticed immediately the way his eyes moved around CIC. He was not looking at the equipment with curiosity. He was not looking at it with the healthy intimidation that most new officers feel when they see a wall of tactical displays for the first time. He was looking at it the way a man looks at a restaurant menu in a language he does not speak, deciding that the food probably is not that good anyway. He asked me how long I had been in the Navy. I told him, 26 years. He nodded and said something I will never forget. He said, "That is a long time to do the same job." I smiled. I said, "With respect, sir, it is not the same job. It is the same ocean. The job changes every watch." He did not understand what I meant. He smiled back, the polite smile of a man who has already decided he is the smartest person in the room, and he moved on. Over the next 3 weeks, Ensign Price made his presence known. He was not content to simply learn his division and qualify on his basic watch stations, which is what every new ensign is supposed to do. He wanted to optimize. That was his word, optimize. He used it constantly. He wanted to optimize the watch rotation. He wanted to optimize the underway checklist. He wanted to optimize the bridge team's communication procedures, which had been refined over decades by generations of officers and enlisted sailors who had earned every syllable of every standard command through blood and experience. He began attending bridge watches as an observer, which was normal and encouraged. But instead of quietly absorbing, he would ask questions that revealed a dangerous gap between his confidence and his competence. He once asked the officer of the deck why we did not simply use GPS based autopilot for channel transit instead of posting a full navigation detail with a helmsman, a lee helmsman, two bearing takers, and a navigation plotter. The OD, a seasoned lieutenant junior grade named Chen, looked at him for a long moment and explained patiently that redundancy in navigation was not inefficiency. It was survival. GPS signals could be jammed. Autopilot could malfunction. The human beings on the bridge were the last line of defense between 8,900 tons of steel and a sandbar or a pier or another ship. Price nodded, but I could see it in his eyes. He thought it was waste. He thought all of us, the entire navigation detail, were a relic of a less efficient era. I brought my concerns to the chief of the boat privately. I told him that Price was exhibiting a pattern I had seen once before on a frigate in the early 2000s in an officer who had nearly run us aground off the coast of San Diego because he trusted his spreadsheet more than his bearing drift. The COB listened. He told me to document anything concrete and to keep mentoring the ensign. He said, and I quote, "He will either learn or he will not, and either way the Navy will sort him out." I respected the COB, but I had a feeling in my gut, that tightening in my neck, and it was telling me that the sorting was going to be expensive. The situation escalated in mid-November. The Ardent had been conducting routine training operations off the Virginia coast and was scheduled to return to Naval Station Norfolk for a maintenance period. The transit back was straightforward, a 6-hour steam, arrival at the pier by 1400 hours. But the weather had other plans. A late season nor'easter had developed faster than the forecasters predicted. By the morning of our scheduled return, sustained winds were 30, 5 knots gusting to 50. Seas were running 8 to 12 feet in the open water, and the harbor approach was going to be rough. Visibility was less than a mile in driving rain. The captain, Commander Rice, was a careful man. He had 22 years in the surface fleet and the kind of quiet authority that made you want to perform well simply because disappointing him felt like disappointing your father. Captain Rice assessed the conditions that morning and made the call to delay our return by 12 hours, wait for the worst of the storm to pass, and make the approach in the early morning hours when conditions were forecast to improve. It was the right call. It was the safe call. It was the call that every experienced ship driver in the fleet would have made. But Captain Reyes was also dealing with something I was not fully aware of at the time. The maintenance period was tied to a contract with a civilian repair facility. Every day the ship was late to the pier cost the Navy money. liquidated damages in the contract, scheduled penalties. I learned later that the number was something like $40,000 per day. It was the kind of pressure that flows downhill from the type commander to the squadron commander to the commanding officer, and it sits on the soul's shoulders like a yoke. And Ensign Price, who had somehow inserted himself into a planning meeting he had no business attending, made a suggestion. He suggested, with the earnest enthusiasm of a man who has read about leadership but never practiced it under pressure, that the ship could make the approach in the current conditions if we increased speed to minimize our time in the channel and utilized a streamlined bridge team. He actually used the phrase lean manning model on the bridge of a warship in a storm. He argued that the $40,000 per day penalty was an unnecessary expenditure and that he had reviewed the ship's handling characteristics in the training manual and believed the Ardent was rated for conditions far worse than what we were facing. I was not in that meeting, but Chief Quartermaster Delgado was, and he told me about it afterward, his face the color of old concrete. He said the captain shut Price down immediately, told him that ship handling was not an MBA case study and that the decision to delay was final. Price, according to Delgado, accepted the rebuke with a tight smile, but he did not accept it internally. You could tell. The gears were turning. The man had been told no, and he was not accustomed to the word. What happened next is where the story turns and where I made the decision that I have thought about every single day since. The captain departed the ship that evening by helicopter. He had been summoned to a conference at Fleet Forces Command that could not be rescheduled, and the plan was simple. The XO, Commander Holt, would bring the ship in the following morning when conditions improved. Standard procedure. The XO was qualified. The XO was competent. The XO had the con, but Commander Holt fell ill that night. Badly, the corpsman suspected food poisoning, possibly norovirus, and by 0300, the XO was confined to his stateroom, unable to stand without assistance. The ship's medical officer recommended he remain in his rack. That left the senior watch officer, Lieutenant Commander Torres, as the acting commanding officer for the transit and docking evolution. Torres was a good officer, but a department head, not a ship driver by specialty. He was cautious, and he was wise enough to lean on the experienced enlisted team. Under normal circumstances, this would have been fine. We had done this before. The chief quartermaster, the senior chief boatswain's mate, and I could talk any competent officer through a standard approach. The problem was that Torres was also managing an engineering casualty. One of the four gas turbines had developed a bearing issue during the night, and main propulsion division had been troubleshooting it for hours. Torres was buried in the engineering plant, and into that vacuum stepped Ensign Colton Price. I do not know exactly how it happened. I do not know whether Price volunteered, whether Torres assigned him out of desperation, or whether Price simply showed up on the bridge and assumed authority because no one explicitly told him not to. What I know is that at 0530, when I arrived in CIC to set up for the sea and anchor detail, I was informed by the quartermaster of the watch that Ensign Price was the designated conning officer for the harbor approach and docking evolution, not the officer of the deck. The actual OD was Lieutenant Junior Grade Chen, who was qualified but junior. Price was on the bridge as the con, calling the shots on course, speed, and the approach. I went to the bridge. The rain was hammering the windows so hard it sounded like ball bearings on sheet metal. The wind was howling through the signal bridge above us at a pitch that I had learned over decades to associate with trouble. Visibility was a quarter mile, maybe less. The seas had calmed from the overnight peak, but they were still running 5 to 7 feet in the harbor approach, which was significant for a docking maneuver. I looked at the radar repeater on the bridge wing. I looked at the wind gauge. I looked at the current indicator. And then I looked at Ensign Colton Price, Standing at the centerline Pelorus with his hands clasped behind his back, his chin elevated, his eyes fixed on the gray, nothing beyond the bridge windows. He looked like a recruitment poster. He looked like a man who believed that confidence was a substitute for competence. I approached him. I kept my voice calm, professional, and respectful. Senior Chief, reporting as CIC liaison for the approach, I said. I recommend we hold outside the channel until visibility improves. Current is running 2 knots across the channel from the northeast. With the wind on our port beam, we are going to experience significant set to starboard during the approach. Recommend we also request tug assistance for the docking. 1 boat tug minimum, 2 preferred. Price looked at me. He smiled. That same polite, dismissive smile from the wardroom 3 weeks earlier. He said, Senior Chief, I appreciate your concern. I have reviewed the approach plan. We are going to proceed as scheduled. Speed 15 knots in the channel to maintain steerage and minimize exposure time. No tugs. The tug contract is $14,000, and I have already informed the navigator that we will not be requesting tug services. $14,000. He was going to save the Navy $14,000 by docking an 80, 900-ton destroyer in a crosswind and a cross current without tug assistance. In a storm, with a quarter mile of visibility, because he had reviewed the approach plan in a manual in his stateroom on a calm night, with no water moving under his feet. I felt the old tightening in my neck. I said, Sir, respectfully, 15 knots in the channel is excessive. Standard approach speed is 5 to 8 knots. At 15 knots, we will have less than 90 seconds to execute the turn to the pier. With the current set, we will need to compensate with 20 to 30 degrees of right rudder just to maintain track. If we miss the turn, we are going into the East Pier or the dry dock at the far end of the basin. I recommend we reduce to 5 knots and request tugs. He did not look at me when he responded. He looked straight ahead at the rain. He said, Your recommendation is noted, Senior Chief. My orders stand. 15 knots. No tugs. Let us show them what this crew can do. I stood there for 5 seconds. 5 seconds is a long time on a bridge when you can hear the sea and feel the deck moving beneath your boots. I thought about going over his head to Lieutenant Junior Grade Chen, the OD, but Chen was 26 years old, and Price, despite being junior to him in time aboard, was speaking with an authority that Chen seemed unwilling to challenge. I thought about calling Torres on the sound, powered phone. But Torres was 3 decks below in main control, wrestling with a turbine that was threatening to take the plant offline entirely. I thought about the captain's standing orders, which required tug assistance in winds above 30 knots. The winds were gusting to 45. But the captain was not aboard. The XO was unconscious in his rack, and Price had the con. So I made my decision. I went back to CIC. I sat down at my console. I pulled out my green logbook, the one I had kept for 26 years, the one that had saved my career twice before. And I began to write. I wrote down the time. I wrote down the weather conditions, wind, seas, visibility, current. I wrote down my recommendation. I wrote down Price's response verbatim. I wrote down the names of every person on the bridge who heard the exchange. And then I picked up the sound, powered phone to the bridge, and I said 5 words that I had earned the right to say through a quarter century of faithful, unbroken service. Aye, sir. Your orders. And I complied, maliciously. I fed the bridge exactly the information they asked for. Bearing to the channel entrance. Range to the turn. Speed over ground. Set and drift. I gave them every number, every data point with clinical precision. I did not editorialize. I did not add caution. I did not say what I would normally say, which was something like bridge CIC. Recommend you start your turn now. You are approaching the point of no return. I simply provided data. Cold, clean, accurate data. Because that was what I was ordered to do. Ensign Price had told me the previous week during a watch turnover brief that CIC should limit its communications to the bridge to factual data calls and leave the tactical recommendations to the conning officer. He said it was more efficient. He said it reduced bridge clutter. So I gave him efficiency. I gave him a clean, clutter-free picture of his own destruction. The Ardent entered the channel at 15 knots. The moment we crossed the sea buoy, I felt the ship begin to skid. The cross current hit the hull like a hand pushing against the flat of a blade. The wind was on the port beam, and together, the current and the wind were shoving us to starboard at a rate that I estimated from the radar at roughly 3 knots of set. At 15 knots of forward speed, that meant for every mile we traveled down the channel, we were being pushed 500 yards to the right. The channel was 600 yards wide. I keyed the phone. Bridge, CIC, set to starboard, 3 knots. Track is diverging from centerline. Range to pier turn, 2,000 yards. That was it. That was all I said. No recommendation, no warning, just numbers. I heard Price's voice come back thin and tight. He said, very well. And then, after a pause, helm, come right to course 275. I heard the helmsman repeat the order, his voice carrying that particular flatness that an experienced sailor uses when he is executing an order he does not believe in. Coming right to course 275A, the ship swung. Too fast. Price had not accounted for the rudder lag at 15 knots. The bow came right, and the stern kicked to port, and suddenly the ship was crabbing sideways down the channel like a car on black ice. I watched the radar. The pier was ahead and to starboard. The dry dock was dead ahead. The range was closing at a rate that made my stomach fold in on itself. Bridge CIC. Range to pier, 1,000 yards. Speed over ground, 14 knots. Set to starboard, now 4 knots. Recommend. I stopped myself. I almost said it. I almost broke my own compliance. I swallowed the word. I said, standing by for your orders, sir. Silence from the bridge. 3 seconds. 5. I could hear the wind through the phone circuit. I could hear someone breathing hard. Then Price's voice, and it was different now. The polish was gone. The MBA confidence was cracking like cheap lacquer in the sun. He said, helm, all back full. All back full. The most desperate command in surface warfare. The emergency brake of a ship that has no brakes. All back full at 14 knots of forward speed and across current in a narrow turning basin. The gas turbines screamed. The entire ship shuddered as the screws reversed pitch. The vibration came up through the deck plates and into my boots and into my bones and into my teeth. The Ardent groaned. 8,900 tons of steel does not stop quickly. Momentum is not a suggestion. Momentum is a law. I watched the radar. The pier was at 500 yards, then 400, then 300. The ship was slowing, but the set was still pushing us to starboard, and now the reversed screws were pulling the stern to port, which meant the bow was swinging to starboard toward the pier like a compass needle finding north. 200 yards. I could hear shouting on the bridge now through the phone circuit. I could hear Chen's voice cutting through the noise, calling for the emergency breakaway signals. I could hear the boatswain's mate of the watch on the 1MC, the ship's general announcing system, his voice cracking as he called, all hands brace for impact. 150 yards. 100. I could see the pier on the radar now as a solid green line, close enough that the returns were merging with our own hull's return. And then, and I do not know whether it was God or physics or sheer blind luck, the current shifted. It happens in harbors. The tidal flow eddies around the pier structures and creates pockets of slack water. We hit one of those pockets at exactly the moment the backing power finally overcame our forward momentum. The ship slowed. The bow swung. Not enough to clear the pier entirely, but enough to change the angle of impact from a perpendicular collision, which would have been catastrophic, to a glancing blow. The Ardent's port bow struck the concrete fender system at the end of Pier 7 at a speed of approximately 2 knots. The sound was something I will carry to my grave. It was not a bang. It was a deep, tearing groan like the ship was crying out. The impact buckled 14 feet of the hull's exterior plating above the waterline. It shattered three of the concrete fender pilings. It snapped the forward mooring bollard clean off the pier and sent it tumbling into the water like a discarded toy. On the bridge, every unsecured object became a projectile. I heard later that the quartermaster's coffee mug hit the forward bulkhead hard enough to leave a dent in the metal. But the hull held below the waterline. The watertight integrity was maintained. No flooding, no casualties, unless you count the boatswain's mate third class, who sprained his wrist bracing against a stanchion, and the pride of Ensign Colton Price, which did not survive. The tugs arrived 17 minutes later. Two of them. They had been dispatched by the harbor pilot the moment the Ardent was observed entering the channel at an unsafe speed. They pushed us gently off the fender system and into our berth with the quiet competence of professionals who had seen this kind of thing before and who would see it again. The cost of the tug assist, which Price had declined to save $14,000, was billed to the ship anyway. Emergency rate $22,000. The cost of the whole repair was estimated at $1.4 million. The damage to the pier was assessed at $370,000. Total cost of Ensign Price's optimization, approximately $1.8 million. Rounded up for the investigation costs, the temporary reassignment of crew, and the delay to the maintenance period, the final figure that appeared in the Jejman investigation report was $2.1 million. The investigation took 6 weeks. I provided my logbook, every entry, every timestamp, every recommendation I had made, and every response I had received. Lieutenant Junior Grade Chen provided a statement confirming that I had advised against the approach speed and the decision to decline tugs. Chief Quartermaster Delgado provided a statement regarding Price's comments in the planning meeting. The helmsman, a quartermaster second class named Rivera, provided a statement that was 3 pages long and included the phrase, "I have never been so certain that I was about to die." Ensign Price was found to have violated the captain's standing orders regarding tug assistance in high winds. He was found to have exercised poor judgment in assuming the con for an evolution he was not qualified to supervise. He was found to have ignored the counsel of experienced enlisted advisors. He was issued a punitive letter of reprimand. His qualification progress was suspended. He was transferred off the Ardent within 30 days. I heard later, through the Chief's Mess Network that operates on every waterfront in the Navy, that he was reassigned to a shore billet at a supply depot in the Midwest as far from salt water as the Navy could put him without discharging him. He resigned his commission 8 months later. Commander Rice returned to the ship the day after the incident. I was standing on the quarterdeck when his car pulled up. He walked up the brow and he stopped and he looked at the buckled plating on the port bow. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he looked at me. He said, "Senior Chief, I read your log." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You did everything right." And then he paused and he said, "And I am sorry I was not here." I told him it was not his fault. He nodded. But I could see it in his eyes. He carried it. A captain always carries it. I was awarded a Navy Commendation Medal for my actions during the incident, specifically for maintaining accurate and continuous radar reporting under emergency conditions. The citation was carefully worded. It praised my professionalism without explicitly condemning anyone by name. That is how the Navy works. The system protects its own narrative while quietly ensuring that the right people know what happened. I retired 4 months later, not because of the incident. My 30-year letter was already drafted. But I will admit that the Ardent's final approach was the last straw on a back that was already bowed. I was tired, not physically. I could still stand a 12-hour watch and feel nothing the next morning. I was tired in a deeper way. I was tired of watching the same lesson get taught to the same kind of person over and over, generation after generation. The ocean is not a spreadsheet. A ship is not a startup. The people who operate complex, dangerous systems in unforgiving environments are not inefficiencies to be optimized. They are the reason the system works at all. I think about Colton Price sometimes. Not with anger. I do not hate the man. I pity him in the way you pity someone who walks into a room and does not notice that the floor is wet and the edge of the balcony is close. He did not know what he did not know. That is the most dangerous kind of ignorance. It is the kind that comes with a degree and a firm handshake and the absolute, unshakable belief that knowing a theory is the same as understanding a practice. It is not. Theory is the map, practice is the territory. And the territory, especially when that territory is the North Atlantic in November, will eat your map and spit it back at you in pieces. If you are listening to this and you are young and you have just been given authority over people who know more than you do, I have one piece of advice. Shut your mouth. Open your ears. Watch the hands of the person who has been doing the job for 20 years. Watch how they hold the tools. Watch how they read the room. Watch how they go quiet when something is about to go wrong because they can feel it before you can see it. That silence is not ignorance. That silence is mastery. And if you interrupt it with your optimization and your lean Manning models and your $14,000 cost savings, you will learn what the ocean has been trying to teach every arrogant soul since the first fool built a boat and pointed it at the horizon. The sea does not read resumes. The sea does not care about your efficiency metrics. The sea only asks one question: do you respect me? And if the answer is no, the sea collects. I know. I have watched it collect. I hung my ball cap on the hook behind my front door the day I retired. It is still there. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and the wind picks up outside, I can hear it. That low, patient grinding. The sea testing the steel, deciding whether tonight is the night. It is always the night somewhere. And somewhere on some bridge, some senior chief is standing behind some ensign, watching, waiting, hoping the kid is smart enough to listen. I hope he is. I really do. But I keep my logbook close, just in case.